I'd love to hear more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess there's an urge to categorize things in a singular way. But in my life or in my experience, I have different practices, and sometimes they overlap, and sometimes they can repel each other or be very different to each other at different times. So, for example, as an artist, I do land art and painting and field recordings, but around this art practice, I also have a life with having co-parenting situation with young twins and having a sort of academic practice to some extent by working at the University of Arts London in a online context. So it feels like my practice is different things at different times to me, which is one of the things I like about it because it keeps it exciting.
So, how would you describe what you do? And well, this is like a podcast, it's supposed to be not visual, but how would you? So, land art, that sounds really exciting. What do you mean by that?
The honest answer is I'm not really sure because I think land art might be a kind of fake category, and I don't really know what we're talking about when we talk about land art. So this sort of confusion or not knowing is part of what drives my interest in it. And related to land art, this idea that some things that are natural or presented as natural in the world maybe aren't natural, and vice versa, is something I'm interested in by doing land art.
I really like this idea that not knowing and confusion and ambiguity is actually the resource that we use, because I think in computer science research or digital investigation, it's always like you want to find out things, you produce knowledge, and I think that really is really unique about creative methods of investigations. We produce uncertainty, but it's a constructive uncertainty.
Yes, it makes it can make like the walls of knowledge vibrate sometimes.
That's beautiful. I like that. So, how did you get to pursue that type of investigation? What drove you? What drives you?
I think lots of different things came together around the same time. So I really started getting into land art probably in the early 2010s, and part of that was wanting to explore, get on the outside of the art world as I experienced it then. So getting outside the gallery system or the market system in a very literal way by going into the landscape. And then by doing that, it was very interesting thinking that maybe, or finding out that maybe there isn't an outside so much, or if there is, how can we really get outside of the outside? So I became very interested in how, through my work or through art as a vehicle, things can simultaneously be kind of included within power structures at the same time as trying to become independent of them. So I was making some interventions in different countries and different places that was sort of like trying to be bad art as a way of critiquing the category of art, if that makes sense.
Bad art sounds exciting. What is bad art?
Bad art is good art, man. You know, it's one of these. I mean, I think it's a very personal question. What is bad art? I mean, I can't really answer that because sometimes bad art can become good art. I think it depends on its context. It depends on where it's cited, and it depends on lots of other factors. which are not necessarily part of the art object itself.
So, if it's hard to define what is bad art, what makes good art for you?
For me, as an artist with my work, if I make art that I find annoying, if I can annoy myself, that's interesting. And if I can annoy my audience or reduce my audience through art, I think that's interesting. So those would be the kind of factors of when I'm making stuff. I'm always thinking, how can I annoy myself or interrupt myself or confuse myself? How can I contest my intuition? These kinds of things make art worthwhile for me.
Have you got an example of something that was successfully annoying that either you encountered or you produced?
Yes, let me just think. I did a project with I was invited to do a public art project in Scotland for the Edinburgh Annual in 2011, and I was very interested in this idea of a sculpture trail. And at the time in London where I was working, there was a big survey exhibition called Young London, which brought together all the kind of cool young artists of London in a big warehouse, and I was not included in this, so I was very annoyed, and I thought that would be an interesting place to start from. So for my sculpture trail at the Edinburgh Annual, I made a sculpture trail. It was I think it was about 60 or 70 asparaguses, like the vegetable, and each asparagus was named after one of the artworks in the Young London exhibition in London. And the sculpture trail was called Young London, and it was installed along the waters of Leith, which is a river that flows into Edinburgh from the sea. And in the river there are Anthony Gormley sculptures placed every so often, and so this was like a parallel sculpture trail alongside it that was quite poetic, because each asparagus had the same title as an artwork from this zeitgeisty show. And I think that was quite a nice example of a project that was fairly kind of conceptually driven, but also kind of funny, in this idea of having vegetables laid along a path in an art festival. It sort of made sense eventually.
I mean, also asparagus is a great choice. I mean,
it just looks weird, doesn't it?
Are there any questions that you always have, like, as a staple thing that you want to answer in your work? Is that something that you carry along? That's the thing for me. I always explore one single thing. Have done for 10 years now.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. I mean, I suspect I might be exploring one single thing, but maybe I don't have a word for it yet, or a thing. Like whenever I'm making, or whenever I'm thinking about stuff, I'm interested in the difference between something being weird or something being cool. I'm like, is this weird or is this cool? And sometimes it's good to make weird stuff, and sometimes it's good to make cool stuff. It depends on the context and the mood.
And do you have anybody you make the art for? Is it for you, or is it for art's sake, or for an audience? Or do you like to whittle down your audience? Is it for like the good audience?
Yeah, like really bad, like really bad avant-garde jazz music. Like fewer people, the better. And I think it's an interesting project now. I mean, when I started out, or the kind of the logic of the way we look at things in a kind of neoliberal, marketized way, sort of like looking through shop windows, that sort of way of looking at stuff. That seemed to be the very how you should be looking at stuff. when you started out. And so as an extension, there was this assumption that the more people who got to see your work, the better. And I think that through recent developments with social media and things like this, that's become the kind of pervasive assumption that the more people, the more eyeballs that see your work, the better. And I became very interested in working against that. So thinking not the kind of aspirational audience of the sort of upper ends of the art world, but maybe a really strange audience made up of strange people in different places at different times who have different kinds of connections to my work, and thinking what's the best way to kind of reduce them to a manageable number. I did before COVID, I was doing a series of, well, since 2009 I've been doing a series of paintings. I think there's probably about 300 now, and each painting uses the same stencil and the same image and the same, more or less the same technique to make them. And so I was doing weekly salons in my studio where I'd invite friends to come and look at some paintings in progress, but it was always the same paintings every week. So after the end, the first few, maybe 10, 20, 30 people came, and at the end it was like 4 or 5. And I thought that was quite an interesting thing, because those 4 or 5 people had a different connection to the work or to the project. So I'm interested in things like this.
I mean, particularly in the context of digital art, this is like the perfect age for you, because if you're really into like medieval door hinge restoration, then that may be like one in your city, but on the internet you will find a very passionate door hinge community who is very excited about that.
Yeah, it's really strange. Like with my artwork, I don't have like a gallery represents. I'm not represented by a commercial gallery or anything like this, but so most of my projects that happen sort of outside my studio, which are collaborations with other people, a lot of these tend to come from emails of kind of weird people who I've never met before, who have seen it online, or who are friends of friends who have heard something about something and want to make a project together. So I've had some really interested, unexpected invitations and collaborations this way, which is very nerve-wracking but very exciting, because each one could be the last thing that I ever do, but each one is very, very different. So I was invited to make a painting exhibition in Switzerland in a medieval house with a couple of guys who were interested in art and painting. And then in this last summer I was invited to go to Mallorca have an exhibition in a shopping centre in a very touristic part of the island. So these are interesting. It's an interesting way of working, because it is very much unexpected and in unusual places that I'm very interested to go to and experience as an artist and as a person.
I'm really fascinated about your relationship with the audience, and what maybe is the role of critique, or has it changed? How do you engage with it? What is it meant for you, and what does it mean now? And maybe to do critique, what is that part of? How big of a part is that of your practice?
I think quite significant. Like, I think my work has a sort of, I think the land art I do especially has a kind of auto-criticality, in that it's critical by default. So rather than me making critical content or a clearly articulated critique against market conditions or something specific, because the work itself and where it's situated and the kind of mood behind its production, it has a kind of criticality which is more ambient perhaps than anything. It's a bit more ephemeral and therefore maybe a bit more interesting and appealing to people perhaps. So I think my work does have it, generally speaking, I think people see my work as being from a kind of critical art tradition, um, but it's not the sort of, it's not, that's a kind of byproduct of the work, if that makes sense. Um, and in terms of people's critique of the work, it's, yeah, it's like I had a really interesting invitation from a art critic before an exhibition I did a month or so, a couple of months ago, and we met in the shopping centre in Lewisham, and there was a section of the Berlin Wall there, and it was there for some strange sort of public art thing. And so we met in the Starbucks by the Berlin Wall in Lewisham in the shopping centre, and we had a very interesting conversation about graffiti art and street art and painting um, within this kind of critical framework, whereby we met at this place because it related to some of the critique that maybe some of my paintings might make to do with street art or painting histories and things like this. So it was a generative experience. It was a kind of conversation rather than about value judgments as such. So I quite like the idea of a critical dialogue, critical conversations, rather than critical statements or critical responses.
Mm. And what are the characteristics of a good critique, and maybe of a bad critique? And not good as in positive, but what makes a constructive critique for you? What kind of critique do you want, or would you embrace? And
I quite like funny critique.
mm-hmm.
I think it's nice to have a bit of humour, and I like critique or criticality where the conditions that it happens in or occurs in maybe are part of the critique or the criticality itself. So a criticality that takes into account its wider role or wider position, because sometimes it's interesting when people who think they can't critique something actually end up critiquing it somehow, either by mistake or in their own way. So I remember once I was doing an art fair. I was showing some artwork by friends in an auction house in London, and it was quite theatrical and quite pompous, as the art world can sometimes be. And so I thought it'd be really funny on one day just to invite my grandma to come down from Hull, and she and I sat in these silly chairs in front of the pictures, which were very good art, but we were just kind of vibing with the theatricality, and we were hanging out and having a conversation about about everything and nothing, and pictures and paintings, and I thought that was like an example of a nice critique of the situation that the conversation takes place.
I like that a lot. Yes. Thank you so much. I have probably one last question, and it's gonna be a big one. And I recently started reading Letters to a Young Poet again by Rilke. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Rilke is a German or Austrian poet who is brilliant. That means a lot to me. And he received 10 letters from an aspiring poet, and the letters from the poet are gone, but Rilke's responses have become a really famous book. And they're called Letters to a Young Poet, and then there are variations, the Letters to a Young Painter, maybe others. Anyway, if you think back, what kind of lessons have you learned you maybe wish you would have known when you were embarking on your journey? Maybe like before going into academic art, when you make that transition from, making art, like which every human does all the time, to making art in the more academic, in the more institutional context. What kind of making art in the more academic, in the more institutional context? what kind of shortcuts would you want to give yourselves in retrospect?
That's a good question. I think my initial response is maybe I wouldn't want to have any shortcuts, because making mistakes and getting lost and being confused was or is the best way to learn. So I would maybe think of more ways to frustrate the journey than smooth it out. So I guess, yeah, generally to maybe rush a little bit less would be the guide, and also not to look around, or not to take the sort of naturalized art world or the naturalized academic world or these systems as being definitive. To take them seriously when they need to be taken seriously, but also not to feel too subject to them. That would be my general advice, and not to worry too much either.
From somebody who certainly didn't rush to get to where he is. Yeah, I resonate. Yeah, maybe I took this a little bit too long, but I like that.
So, what was your journey? How do you mean it wasn't unrushed?
I started off in marine biology and climate change research. Ended up doing anthropological fieldwork in the Arctic.
Wow.
Now I'm teaching computer science in an art school. So exactly, didn't want to go that straightforward route, and gave myself plenty of time to derive and learn plenty on the way. And in retrospect, it all comes together. Yeah, in retrospect, I use all the skills that I acquired, but it didn't make any sense while I was being on them. It was just, here's the thing that I should be doing, and here's something interesting to do. And I kept on going with interesting.
Yeah, it's always like the side, things coming from the side, around the corners.
Thank you so much for your time, and it was really, really brilliant to speak to you. I'm really glad I got to know you a little bit more.
Yeah, likewise. I've been in a couple of the same meetings. It's nice to learn a bit more about faces behind the profiles pictures, or the people behind the profile pictures, rather. But yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope it goes well, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how these courses take shape. It's quite an exciting time, I think.
I feel the same way. Yeah, I'm very excited, and yeah, again, thank you so much. This was really, really great and perfect for what you're looking for.
Right. Oh, I'm good. Let me know if I can help with anything else. Always happy to.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome, MJ. I'll see you sooner or later, I hope.
Bye bye.
Yeah, bye.